All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Friday edition of Human Anatomy. Thanks, everyone, for being here on time. I don't mean to eavesdrop generally, but I just overheard someone say this has been the longest week of the semester, and I hear ya. It feels that way right now. We still got a little bit more before Thanksgiving break, so hang in there. And yeah, just know that we're all feeling that mid-semester burn right now. All right, with that in mind, though, we're just gonna keep going ahead in class today. We're working on the brain. We're continuing what we've been talking about all week, and we will wrap up the brain next week. So today's agenda looks like this. I'm going to start off by reviewing Wednesday's Take It Out, just a couple of questions about what we've been covering so far, specifically on the brainstem and the diencephalon a little bit, although we'll talk about that more today. And then and Wednesday, someone asked a great question about why, in an evolutionary sense, we have this decussation, this crossing over of your nerves. And I did a little bit of research on this. So led me down another interesting rabbit hole. So I want to share that with you as well. Then we'll talk about the cerebellum. We'll talk about the diencephalon. And then I have quizzes number 4, your last quiz graded for you. I can give you your grades back. A few students in the class have yet to take the quiz, so I can't give you your quiz back, but I have them. You can take a look at it, and then I'll just keep it. We'll do that at the end of class. And then I've got just a few course reminders and a Take It Out for you today. So before we get into the brain, what questions do you have? Cool. All right. So on Wednesday, I asked you as you were walking out, which of the following are part of the brain stem? And most of you got this right, but I just want to remind you of this as by way of review. And the 3 correct answers are here: the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, and the pons. So remember that those 3 sections of the brain together compose the brain stem. It was interesting to me that all of you said pons, but only about 90% said the medulla and 80% said the midbrain. And I was a little bit surprised by that everyone was like, yeah, pons, that's brainstem, but then medulla, you were a little wishy-washy on. So I'm not quite sure where that was coming from, but make sure you review your notes and make sure you remember that those 3 parts of the brain together are the brainstem. The other question I asked you is, which of the following are part of the central nervous system? So CNS, and almost all of you got these right, but not quite everybody. The only thing on here that wasn't part of the central nervous system was the humerus, which of course is the bone in the stylopodium of your upper arm, not part of the central nervous system. Everything else is. So remember that your central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. And on this list, we see spinal cord, and then everything else is part of the brain. Now, I know we haven't talked about some of those parts of the brain in detail yet, but I have kind of introduced you to them, and you've seen this diagram a bunch of times. So make sure you know that everything on here, except for the humerus, is part of the central nervous system. Some of these we didn't talk about in detail. You know, the thalamus we didn't get to yet, and that's okay, but we'll talk about that today. So with that in mind, this is the brain. We've been working our way kind of caudal to rostral. We talked about the brain stem, which again is the medulla, the pons, and midbrain. And today, we're going to focus on this guy right here, the most posterior and inferior portion of the brain, the cerebellum. Before we do, though, I want to talk about this decussation. So this is a really interesting thing that came up. We talked about how in the pyramids of your medulla oblongata, we have this decussation where these nerves basically cross hemispheres of your body, such that your right hemisphere of your brain, actually this is the ventral view, so this will be like this, such that your left hemisphere of the brain has motor control of the right side of your body, and vice versa, right? The question came up, why in an evolutionary sense does this happen? Why are bodies built like that, right? And it turns out there's not necessarily like a single clear answer, but there's some really interesting ideas that I want to share with you. The first is something called the somatic twist hypothesis, and this is really kind of cool. So in invertebrates, we generally, or actually not generally speaking, their body plan is such that they have like a brain kind of thingy, although that's a little variable depending if you're a jellyfish or whatever. But let's just talk about something like an arthropod. And then they have their digestive tract is up top, And the primary, it's not a spinal cord, but the primary like nerve cord extends here. This is the world's worst diagram. I'm going to make sure I get this on the camera there, just so everyone can see how bad a drawer I am. And the spine, in this case, the nerve cord, I'll call it, is ventral to the digestive tract. And so in other words, their internal organs are kind of arranged exactly the opposite of ours. The thought is that somewhere in our evolutionary history between invertebrates and vertebrates, that this whole body plan got twisted around, such that now now we have a brain up here, and the primary nerve cord is dorsal, and the digestive system is ventral, just like in you, right? Your spinal cord is dorsal to your digestive tract. And so if we think about a basic body plan, somewhere along the evolutionary history, we had something that looked like this, and then it got twisted around. When you twist something, of course, now the right side of the body, the right side of the brain is controlling the left side of the body, and vice versa. So I want to emphasize that it's not like a single individual critter that just got twisted around one day. It's over evolutionary time, the way those body parts develop essentially twist during development, and so you get this decussation. Now, why is this potentially beneficial is an even more interesting question. And one potential hypothesis is that it has to do with predator avoidance. So what's cool is that the muscles of your appendages are controlled by the opposite hemisphere of your brain, but the muscles of your core are controlled by the same side of your brain. So if you're a fish, you don't really have much in the way of limbs, right? You have some fins, right? But mostly your locomotion is controlled by these muscles that run down the center line of the body. And so what is interesting, if you think about predator avoidance, you think about an animal needing to react really, really quickly when it spots a predator. In the case of a fish, if it spots a predator over here, that information is going to go to its right hemisphere because in addition to this decussation, we have the optic chiasma. We'll talk about that in lab this week, where information from your left eye goes to the right hemisphere of your brain. It crosses over. And that has to do with kind of the physical arrangement of nerves in your head and the way your eyes are arranged in your skull more than anything. The takeaway message, though, here is this information from the left side of the body goes to the right hemisphere, and then it triggers this super fast response to contract the muscles along the midline of the body, but on the right side. When those muscles contract, the fish bends away from that predator, right? So that makes good sense. Now, if you have limbs and those limbs are controlled by the opposite hemisphere, for example, in a frog, what's interesting here is that to avoid the predator, you actually need to activate those limbs on the same side as the predator because you need to use those legs to push off and move away, right? Whether you're swimming or hopping or whatever you're doing. So now it's actually beneficial and quicker if this information that's held in the right hemisphere goes directly to the left side of the body. So to go back to the evolutionary question, this is one potential explanation why early in our evolutionary history, it was beneficial to have this crossing over because then you can more quickly react to potential predators. So a little bit of a tangent from human anatomy, but it was a really interesting question. And I know a lot of you are zoo majors. Maybe you'll take vertebrate anatomy with me in the fall next year, which would be cool. It's a really fun course. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that we get into in more detail on that. So thanks for asking. That was Holly. I think you asked that question. Yeah, awesome question. That was good. Any other thoughts, comments, questions on that? All right, let's get back to the human brain. This is the figure and chart that you've seen many, many times. Just as a quick reminder, these are the major structures in the adult brain that we're going to cover. And these are the developmental regions that give rise to those structures. Remember, again, just by way of review, that the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata are part of the brainstem. And remember that they are all derived from different embryonic tissues. Now, interestingly, this metencephalon, the embryonic metencephalon, derived from the adult structures into the pons, part of the midbrain, but also the cerebellum, which is this guy right back here. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is this, well, it takes up about 10% of your brain, maybe a little 10 to 15%, and it is dorsal and posterior to the pons, which is right here, and your medulla, so it's right behind here. This, remember, is the fourth ventricle, so this is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. You can see it there. As we work through the cerebellum, I do have a study guide for you. So I'm going to give you a second to pull this up. Same format as the others. It's Google Slides. You can save it and manipulate it as you like. I won't look at it or collect it. It's just a resource to make improve the quality of your life. I'm going to erase this diagram, frankly, because it's embarrassing. Okay, so let's take a look at the cerebellum. This is a dorsal view. So this is looking at the cerebellum from behind, right? Yeah, that's correct. And just like your cerebrum, you have two hemispheres of the cerebellum, the right and the left hemisphere. And they are separated by a structure that's called the vermis, which is this kind of attachments, I'll call them, in the middle. They look kind of worm-like, hence the name vermis, which comes from the Latin for Latin or Greek. I think it's Latin for worm. And so it looks kind of like someone took a bunch of spaghetti noodles and like squished them together in a mold and compacted them really tightly, basically, is what it looks like. Now, each of the hemispheres is further divided into three lobes. We have the anterior lobe, which is in the front, not surprising, the posterior lobe in the back. So the anterior lobe of the left hemisphere is this region right here. The posterior lobe is right here. And the right hemisphere, again, we have anterior, posterior. And then you can't see it on the diagram because it's deep to the posterior lobe, but we have something called the flocculonodular lobe. And if you ever want to pull out an awesome vocabulary word at a party, flocculonodular is the word you're looking for. You will impress your friends. They'll be like, damn, you learned a lot in human anatomy. Maybe they'll take it next semester. Notice I'm just giving you a brief overview of some of the functions of these lobes of the hemispheres of the cerebellum. Importantly, the cerebellum is essential for coordinating movement. So it allows you to move fluidly through space. Think about any time you take a step or even move your arm, it's not just one or two muscles that are contracting, it's a whole bunch of muscles contracting and relaxing in coordination. And that takes a lot of integration of information from your sensory input to produce these smooth movements via sensory motor output. And that happens primarily in your cerebellum. You'll notice here that in the flocculonodular lobe, we also have a center that's important for kind of maintaining equilibrium, so maintaining your balance, and coordinating your head and eye movements, which of course is important for maintaining balance as well. So all of those things are kind of functioning together to keep you on your feet, basically. Go ahead, Kylie. It can be, yep. I don't know the total details of that, but any injury to this part of the brain can definitely affect your balance and your equilibrium generally, but then also the way that information affects your motor output. So it makes it kind of trickier to respond to the environment. And what's important here is a lot of this, most of it, all of this is subconscious. You're not thinking about, all of these little adjustments you're making to your trunk muscles to maintain your balance. Every time you take a step and the surface is slightly uneven, you're adjusting all of these things in this super rapid way. And all of that happens there in the cerebellum. Good question, Kylie. Thanks. All right, let's chop a cerebellum in half and take a look what it looks like on the inside. So this is a coronal section from the posterior view. So this is looking at someone's cerebellum from the back. So if I'm standing here, you're looking through my skull at my cerebellum, and then we cut it coronally, right? So you chopped it down in the middle, basically, and we want to look at some of these structures inside. A couple of things you'll notice right away. You see gray and white matter, just as other parts of your central nervous system. The white matter you see here is kind of like this branch-like structure. This is called the arbor vitae, which translates literally as the tree of life. So called simply because it has this branching structure. But this is white matter. So what do you think you would find in this white matter, just from what you know? Myelinated axons, boom, good. Surrounding the arbor vitae is gray matter, the cerebellar cortex. Remember, cortex comes from the word for tree bark, for bark, so it's on the outside. Then we have some gray matter on the inside of the arbor vitae, and that is called the deep cerebellar nuclei. So deep because it's deep to the arbor vitae and the cerebral cortex, cerebellar because it's in the cerebellum, and then nuclei because these are it's gray matter where there's centers of cell bodies, of neurons, and unmyelinated interneurons. You can see the spinal cord emerging right here. So that means that the medulla would be farther away from the other side of the cerebellum here, and then your pons is somewhere here, and then your midbrain is kind of up here behind the cerebellum in this view. Oh, look, I have all this text too, and I just talked about it. So let me put the text up there for you. Sorry about that. I meant to kind of walk through those, and I just got so dang excited about the cerebellum. Just want to say flocculonodular globe over and over again. It's like a tongue twister in itself. They should use that like in theater classes before you have to, you know how you say like, you need unique New York, like get your voice warmed up. They should just do flocculonodular. Anyone ever taken like a theater acting class? You do these exercises beforehand to get your tongue moving. No one's ever taken a theater class, like an acting? Yeah, did they do phrases like this? Like, you need unique New York. Yeah, I love that one. It's good times. All right, so that is the cerebellum from the coronal section. And I think, did I provide this diagram in the note sheet for you? You have this one? Okay, sorry, I don't remember exactly which ones I put in there. Let's look at this from another angle. So I want to show you these same structures, but now from a parasagittal section. So remember, parasagittal is cutting down the body this way. And so this is as if someone was standing this way, you cut down the body. Notice though it's a parasagittal, it's not down the midline, but rather offset from the midline. And this allows us to see the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain without slicing them. And you can see the arbor vitae from this view. You can see the cerebellar cortex. You can see pretty clearly the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe, especially since they're color coordinated there. And you can see deep to the posterior lobe. Now you can see this little guy right here, the flocculonodular lobe. Notice that when we cut along this plane as well, we can see this fourth ventricle really well. So this is filled with what? Cerebrospinal fluid, good. We have this choroid plexus, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is produced. And we also, importantly here, I want to bring you back to what we talked about earlier in the week. We have the inferior, middle, and superior cerebellar peduncles. So these are important pathways for neurons traveling from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. The superior cerebellar peduncle is associated with the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncle is associated with the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle is associated with the medulla oblongata. God, that is a sentence. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is associated with the medulla oblongata. That's another good one they should use for theater warm-ups right there. You should just take anatomy and theater together. So you are familiar with these structures. You've seen them earlier in lecture, and I just want to make this explicit association with how they relate to the cerebrum. Excuse me, cerebellum. I keep saying cerebrum. I don't know why. My poor cerebrum is not working properly. It's mixing up cerebrum and cerebellum. All right, let's talk about the cerebellum's function just a little bit here. And just kind of an overview. Mostly, again, with this class, we're focused on anatomy, but you could take Dr. Vadney's neuroanatomy class. Any of you register for that in the spring, by the way? Have you taken that? No one ends up taking it? That's cool. No judgment. All right. So as I mentioned, the cerebellum is essential for processing information and smoothing out movements. And so the motor cortex of the cerebrum, we haven't talked about the cerebrum yet, but a part of the cerebrum that controls voluntary skeletal muscle contraction. It sends information through the specific nuclei in the pons, the pontine nuclei, and it then travels through the middle cerebellar peduncles to the lateral and anterior posterior lobes. That's actually a little bit more information than I need you to know. What I want you to know is that information from The motor cortex of the cerebrum that controls your voluntary motion travels through the pons and goes to the cerebellum. So basically the cerebellum takes your kind of conscious thought about what you want to do and then allows you to implement that in the world and make it happen in a way that is fluid and maintains your balance, and if you're lucky, maybe even graceful. Additionally, we process information from where our head is in space and information about our equilibrium from the inner ear, and that travels through the medulla in this sense, as well as information on proprioception. So that is sensory input from muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joints from the rest of the body, and that travels from the medulla through the inferior cerebellar peduncles to the flocculonodular lobe, and then to the other lobes of the cerebellum from there. Again, what I want you to know is we're integrating information from both sensory input from both your inner ear and your sense of equilibrium, as well as from the body and their senses of proprioception. And that is traveling via the medulla through that inferior cerebellar peduncle, and that information is processed in basically all three lobes of the cerebellum. So we've talked about information traveling through the pons, through the medulla, and of course, through the midbrain as well. And that is associated with the superior cerebellar peduncles. And here we send information back to the cerebral cortex from the cerebellum to kind of constantly readjust how your movements are being made. And so this is associated with things like muscle memory, right? This is why when maybe if you're learning an instrument, at first when you're playing it, you're really kind of awkward and it doesn't feel quote unquote natural and your fingers feel bulky and you can't really do these fine scale movements. And then you play it for a few thousand hours and you get really good at it, right? Or even sports too, throwing a baseball or swinging a field hockey stick or whatever it is. When you first pick something like that up, it's really awkward, but you get better at it over time. That's because these sensory pathways become more and more developed over time. And if you want to test that, what you can do is, let's say you're, with some exceptions, you learned a lot of these skills with one hand or another. So let's say you're a really adept guitar player and you want to kind of just get an idea of how much these pathways are developed and you're playing guitar. Switch around, try to play guitar left-handed, see how that feels. If you're a baseball player, a softball player, try to switch your mitt hand and your throwing hand and see how that feels. And you'll feel, generally, most people anyway, there's a few exceptions, can't do that, or they can, but they're very clumsy and awkward about it. And that's because those pathways develop specific to that, that certain side of the body and that certain arm or that certain hand movement, right? And so to see how far you've come, you can just switch hands and then you feel awkward. I've tried, I play guitar and you can try to switch and play guitar the other way. Or if anyone plays like a string instrument, you try to bow with the other hand. It's brutal. I feel like a 2-year-old picking up an instrument. One last piece of information, those fibers going to and from the cerebellum are all ipsilateral, meaning that they don't switch sides. So I talked earlier today about the decussation. That is information from the cerebrum. All of this information to and from the cerebellum is on the same side. So we don't have a crossing over here. Now, in addition to this muscle memory that I just talked about, the cerebellum is also important for some other cognitive functions that include language, problem solving, and task planning. Now, most of those kind of what we call executive functions, higher order functions, happen in the cerebrum, but there are some areas of the cerebellum that are associated with that as well. I'm not going to get into any more detail than that. I just want you to know that some of those functions do happen in the cerebellum. This is another diagram. This is actually what looks like a mid-sagittal cut through the cerebellum. So you can see the medulla, pons, and midbrain all cut as well. I've talked about all of these structures with the exception of these folia. And these are just these folds on the cortex of the cerebellum, as you might guess. Otherwise, all of those structures should look familiar. And this is indeed, I just actually labeled mid-sagittal section. We good? Questions? Yeah, go ahead, Julia.
It might sound stupid, but
No such thing. Go ahead and ask.
it seems like you have to exercise your brain or whatever.
Mhm.
If you do like so many things with one hand,
Uh-huh.
like does it mean that one side of your brain is kind of like more developed or more, I don't know, more exercised than the other? Or
Yeah, it does. And so what happens is those pathways become more developed on the the contralateral side of your brain. So if you're really doing a lot practicing, I don't know, let's say you're a guitar player and you're doing a lot of stuff like intricate movements with your left hand. If you're a right-handed guitar player, right? Then those pathways in your right-hand side of your brain become more developed and kind of integrated. At the same time, different pathways on the left side of your brain are going to become integrated if maybe you're picking, this is your picking hand. And so there are two different kind of sets of connections develop on the opposite side of the brain that are specific to those kinds of motion. And then if you switch and you try to have this hand on the fretboard and this hand do the finger picking, it just doesn't work as well because it's specific to that side of the brain. So it does, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah. I guess I can't. It doesn't work. Sorry, JD, you're out of luck. There we go. This one? Yeah. And that's all I'm going to say about the cerebellum. I feel like a little bit like Forrest Gump in this class sometimes. That's all I'm going to say about that. My mama said, human body's like a box of chocolates. I don't know where that, I don't know where that's going. Okay. We're going to carry on then. We're going to go back to our overview diagram, and we're going to move to our next section of the brain, the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is composed of three major structures: thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. The vast majority of it is the thalamus. We'll spend the most time talking about that. Who's in behavioral endocrinology right now, Dr. Reichard? Anyone in this class? No one is? Has anyone taken it before? You have. You're probably very familiar with the hypothalamus then, because that is a key kind of center where your nervous and endocrine systems are integrated. But let's go ahead and talk about the diencephalon. This is composed of gray matter, and it's in this kind of middle part of the brain surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. So just to back up for a second, see the thalamus or the diencephalon right here, primarily the thalamus. Remember that this is the way this diagram is structured, we can kind of see through the cerebellum, or the cerebrum. And so we're looking through the cerebrum to see this structure inside. So it's basically completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. And there's three parts: the thalamus, which you see big in purple here, the epithalamus, which is this little kind of protrusion off the posterior inferior part of the thalamus. And then we have the hypothalamus, which kind of comes off the anterior inferior portion of the thalamus. So three parts of the diencephalon. Did I include notes for its diagrams for diencephalon with what I gave you too? I did. Okay, cool. Good. All right, so let's look at this. So this is a lateral view of I actually showed this exact same diagram before when we were talking about the brainstem, but now I want to focus on the thalamus. You can see the hypothalamus up front here. Two important structures I'll talk about in more detail, but I just want to orient you. We have the infundibulum, really fun to say too, which is this kind of stalk-like thing that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. The pituitary is an endocrine/nervous organ that is super important for a whole bunch of hormones in your body that I will save for either human physiology or your behavioral endocrinology class. But all kinds of hormones are regulated in the pituitary, and it's composed of both endocrine tissue and nervous tissue. And it is in close kind of communication, I'll say, with the hypothalamus there. Now, just to refresh your memory a bit, the pituitary sits very nicely in this little kind of saddle-shaped structure in bone. Do you remember what bone it sits comfortably in and is well protected? Yeah, the sella turcica of the, which bone? Sphenoid bone, exactly. Yep, that central kind of keystone bone between the cranium and the facial bones and has that little saddle-like structure called the sella turcica. The pituitary sits right there. As I said, most of the diencephalon is composed of the thalamus. What I want to note importantly is that these structures are paired. You have a left and a right thalamus as well. So you can see that, and they're connected by something called the interthalamic adhesion. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so what I mentioned is that the thalamus is composed of gray matter. And what's cool is that there are kind of centers, nuclei of gray matter in the thalamus associated with different functions. So I'm going to show you a diagram here. I don't need you to know all of these different nuclei. I'm not going to get to that level of detail. So I'm going to make that clear before I show it, but I just want to show it so that you can kind of get an idea for how they're structured and what that looks like. So we have about 12 of these nuclei, and each is associated with a different part of your cerebral cortex. And then we have some white matter dividing up these nuclei as well, and kind of carrying those axons between these nuclei in the cerebral cortex. So again, I don't need you to know the names of all of these. I just want to kind of show you how we have these nuclei arranged within the thalamus. Remember, those nuclei are these centers of gray matter that contain these cell bodies as well as these short interneurons. Now, the thalamus is really important, plays an important functional role. Oops. Well, let me back up for a second here. I don't like the way this slide came out, but I'll just leave it there. The thalamus kind of processes sensory information, but importantly, information from all parts of the brain that goes through the cerebral cortex is relayed through these different nuclei. All right, so information going to and from the or to the cerebral cortex goes through these nuclei. And what's cool about these functionally is they act as a kind of gateway. They basically decide what information is important and is going to send to your centers of conscious thought, and what information you can completely ignore. And that's what allows you to focus on certain things. Like if you're in a noisy environment, it allows you to tune out certain things and focus on other things. It allows you also to just ignore the vast majority of information that your body's receiving in a given moment. So I'm thinking that right now, none of you, until I say this, were probably thinking about the way your toes feel in your shoes. Even though those nerve endings were sending information to your brain about like, yeah, your toe is touching your sock, is touching your shoe, or whatever you got going on down there. Constantly sending that information in. That information gets to the thalamus, and the thalamus is like, nah, don't care. And it just doesn't even send that information to your conscious thought. Now that changes. Now that I've said that, you're probably all feeling your toes in your shoes right now. And so this this kind of gateway center is deciding what's important. And so that's a good example. Your auditory input, hearing my melodious voice, heard me talk about your toes in your shoes, and that shifted consciously what your brain thought was important enough to send through to your conscious thought. And so that's constantly shifting. That's why certain things you ignore until all of a sudden it changes and it grabs your attention. So for example, if you're in a room where there's like a fan or a ventilator that's kind of loud or something like that, you kind of don't even notice it. But then when it shuts off, like the air in these buildings, right? You're like, oh man, that was really loud. And you don't notice how loud it was until it goes away. That's because that stimuli changed. And now all of a sudden, these nuclei in your thalamus are like, oh yeah, your brain, you need to think about this. There's something in our world changed. And what we're really attuned to as humans and animals generally is changes in our world. If something is kind of the same all of the time, we can tune it out. And that's true for visual stimuli. It's true for auditory stimuli. It's actually true for smells as well. Like a good example is you might not notice the smell of your parents' house while you're living there, but then you live in college campus for a semester and you go back home and you're like, oh yeah, it smells like home. Maybe it's a good memory, maybe not, I don't know. But those kinds of things that when you're in that situation, you're constantly receiving that input, that's filtered out thanks to your thalamus. But then you go away and you come back and it's new and it becomes something that you can register consciously. So pretty cool function of the thalamus there. Let's see what I want to say about this. Yeah, let's talk about the hypothalamus briefly here. This is a figure, I don't actually like this view very much. Actually, I do like this view because you can kind of see this is inferior view looking up from the pons, and then this, you've got your part of your midbrain here, and you can see the hypothalamus kind of tucked up under the two hemispheres of the thalamus here. And you can see these other structures called the mammillary body. We'll get into that when we do our brain lab in a couple weeks. You'll see some examples of that on the human and sheep brain. And so what I want you to take away from this is that just the location of the hypothalamus here from this different view. If we look at that in cross section where we typically look at it, we see something that looks like this. Exactly as for the thalamus, you don't need to know all of these nuclei in the hypothalamus. I just want you to know again that there's a bunch of nuclei that are gray matter that are responsible for kind of different, each one has associated with a different function. This view is nice to show you this infundibulum and then the pineal gland, or excuse me, not pineal, pituitary gland down here on the end of this stalk. Yep. You can see on this diagram, I'm not getting into this yet, but just to bring a little bit, these optic nerves. So the optic nerves are cranial nerves 1, and they are associated with the eyes, as you might expect, and they cross over. And I want to point this out because I alluded to it before, and this is called the optic chiasma, where those two optic nerves cross over. So information from your right eye goes to your left side of your brain. And we'll see that structure when we do our brain dissections in a couple of weeks. Got the hypothalamus, a bunch of nuclei there, doing a bunch of cool stuff. Again, takeaway message from the hypothalamus is that it's highly integrated with the endocrine system, and it serves to regulate a ton of your endocrine functions. Let me just see where we are. What time is it? We're almost done with the diencephalon, but I might just pause here, see what questions you have. I want to go over a couple other things at the end of class. We can wrap up this guy, talk about the cerebrum next week. Questions? Julia.
Is there any way that the nuclei, like the lower, like they can filter like information?
Oh yeah, totally. That gives you trouble. So for example, which one is it? One of these nuclei is associated with regulation of body temperature, right? And something happens and that nuclei is not functioning or not processing information properly, then your body temperature won't be properly regulated. So maybe you don't sweat when you're really getting hot and you need to, or maybe you feel really cold even though it's not cold. You have a hard time kind of controlling those things. So that's exactly what can happen in these specific areas. That's a great question, Jay. And I guess I'll just show you, since you asked, I'll just show you this slide. Well, actually, no, I don't want to get into it yet just for time, but I'll cover that more next week. It's a great question. Okay, so let's go here. Oh, I didn't put on the agenda, but I do have a Venn diagram for you today too. That's exciting. I want to debrief lecture quiz number 4 for a second here. So this is the in-class quiz you took Monday this week. Here is a histogram of class scores. So remember, this x-axis is grade, and the y-axis shows the number of students that got a particular grade. So we had 5 students get between a 25 and a 30, 4 students get between a 20 and 25, and so on. You see, it's kind of a weird distribution where not many of you got here in the middle. Then this is interesting to me as an instructor. That tells me that like this kind of group of students did well and understood the information. I have another group of students here that didn't do so well on this quiz, and at least for this quiz, they didn't demonstrate that they understood this material very well. You can see the class mean was a 20.5 out of 30, which is a 68%. So a little bit lower than the class's performance on previous closed book assessments anyway. What I was surprised with was generally you did better on the first question as opposed to the second question. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to hold off on talking about that just yet. But I was surprised, actually. When I put this quiz together, I thought that second question would be, you would do better on that for sure. So that's good information for me. As I said, I can't hand back the quizzes yet, but I can open the scores in Blackboard. I'll do that right now as we end class. And then I have them here. If you want to just check in with me after you finish your ticket out, I can show your quiz. I just need it back. Otherwise, reminders, we have some upcoming schedule changes outside the ordinary. The first is that your lecture exam number 2, that says 3, it should be 2. Sorry about that. Let me fix that real quick here. Lecture exam number 2 is this weekend. So it's going to be open Sunday morning through Monday night. It is open book. You have 70 minutes to take it. If you have accommodations for extended time, that's automatically built in there as well. So if you have 50% extended time, then you'll have 105 minutes to take the exam. You do need to take it in one setting. So you can't start it and then pause it and come back to it. It covers joints, muscles, the skull, and the nervous system, but not the brain. So it covers the nervous system up through the brain. So neurons and support cells and all that good stuff. Because we have the exam, we will not have our regular scheduled class on Monday. So yeah, don't come here on Monday morning. And also, you won't be coming in on Tuesday either. I'm trying to make our schedule flexible for election day especially. And so Tuesday's lab will be online and asynchronous. So it'll be available in Blackboard starting Tuesday morning. You'll have a week to do it. You don't need to come into the lab room to do it, unlike last week's lab where it was work on your own time and you did need to go there to draw the skull pieces. This one you can do entirely from a computer. So we won't meet at our regular lab time on Tuesday. If that time is open for you and you can get it done then, that's great. Otherwise, I want to just give everyone a little bit of a flexible schedule. And this lab is actually kind of nice. It's on the sensory system, special senses. So we actually watch some videos to like do some cool tests with your vision to like give yourself optical illusions, and also watch some videos to give yourself a hearing test to see how high pitched frequencies you can hear. Because the older you get, the less high pitched frequencies you can hear. So you do a test to see how high you can get. Mine is not good. I have to say the high pitched, yeah, it doesn't work. Too much rock and roll. Remember, despite not meeting in class, Danny is still going to have tutorial session on Monday for you. And unfortunately, I don't have open hours on Monday either. So just communicate with me via email for the next week if you need anything. I'm going to be off campus for a couple of days myself, running around a bit. But I will be in touch, and we will be back here for a regular class next week, Wednesday morning, and we'll wrap up the brain, probably wrap up the brain. All sound good? All right, last thing, a ticket out for you. As you're doing this, I will open up your grades for your quiz in Blackboard. Just a few questions for you about today's class to see how well you're understanding. And today's Venn diagram, it's not necessarily funny, but I thought this one was pretty clever and I enjoyed it. It's chemical elements and US states. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you very much.